I'll be under the Athens Bridge.
Is there
Plug over there by you?
Yeah, you can actually
I think
take mine.
I think it's going. Little Craig?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm behind Judd.
You guys. You guys good then? I can get going whenever. Need a second? Yeah. Okay. All right. So the article that I chose to look at was titled "A 6-Week Transition to Maximal Running Shoes Does Not Change Running Biomechanics." So yeah. So the purpose of this study, one, was to determine whether runners' biomechanics adapt over time when transitioning to a maximal running shoe. So we know that running shoes will change people's biomechanics and kind of how they interact with the ground as they run. So this was to determine if runners are actually able to adjust to shoes that they're not used to, such as a maximal running shoe, and kind of change their biomechanics in response to that. And previous studies had shown higher impact peaks after a single session for runners changing over to that maximal shoe that were more used to maybe more of a minimalist shoe compared to that max shoe that they used. And so how they set up this study, they recruited 20 runners, both men and women, age 18 to 45. They all had to self-report running at least 15 miles per week. For their study design, they essentially did a pre and post test for each participant. So they looked at like within subject changes over time with a transition to a running shoe or a maximal running shoe. They gave them an acclimation period. So that acclimation period, they just slowly increased the proportion of their weekly mileage in the maximal shoe. And by the final 2 weeks, they ran exclusively in that maximal shoe. What they looked at were things like impact peak, vertical loading rate, using force plates, and they also looked at ankle osteokinematics, inversion, eversion, plantar flexion, and dorsiflexion, using 3D motion capture. They used a 2-way repeated measures ANOVA to compare within participant effects over time and between shoe types. And we also, one second, the shoe at the top, that's going to be what they used as their traditional shoe. That was that New Balance 880 V2. And then for their more maximal shoes, there on the bottom, the Hoka 1-1. So here's a further look at the participants. So for their participants, most of them they had a higher proportion of women, so 14 women and only 6 men. Average age was about 34. Weekly mileage was actually above that threshold of 15 miles per week, and they had it at an average of 22 miles per week. And running experience was about 10 years on average. So pretty experienced runners were used in this study. And then again, I mentioned that acclimation protocol that they used. So each runner kind of just ran whatever they typically would in a given week, but they're instructed to use their maximal shoes for a certain percentage of those miles. So the first week, it was 20% of their run in a maximal shoe. Second week went up to 40%. Third week 30, or third week 60. Fourth week 80, and then those final 2 weeks, they went up to 100% of their mileage in those maximal shoes. And for their results, They actually found no significant changes in any of the biomechanical variables, again, between that pre and post testing. So regardless of that 6-week transition period, runners wearing the maximal shoes, they still were found to have increased loading rate and impact peak compared to using those traditional shoes. And runners in those maximal shoes, also they found that they had a prolonged eversion during toe off, as well as reduced dorsiflexion at initial contact. And again, that was seen for both pre and post testing. If you were in the maximal shoe, you had longer eversion and less dorsiflexion at initial contact. So some of the strengths for this study, again, I mentioned within subject design, so they didn't have to worry about a lot of variability between subjects, which you can imagine is probably pretty large. Some people might be able to adapt and some not so well. They also had this gradual transition. So previous studies, like I mentioned earlier, found, as you'd expect with a more maximal shoe, if someone was wearing a traditional shoe for their entire career and then they switch over to a maximal shoe one day, yeah, they're going to have higher loading rates and impact peaks. So this study used that gradual transition over the period of 6 weeks to get them used to it and allow them some time and training to adapt. So that was one of the strengths, as well as using that two-way ANOVA. So they were able to look at pre and post measures for both groups. Limitations include small sample size, only about 20 total participants. They also only used experienced runners, so I'd be interested to see in a little bit what you guys think, if that would have changed if it was less experienced runners, as well as they did all their testing over ground. So that also might have changed the results a little bit compared to treadmill training. So in conclusion, transitioning gradually to that maximal shoe didn't really change anything about the individual's biomechanical patterns. Runners don't really seem to alter their biomechanics, even given like this acclimation period. They still tend to have the same biomechanical gait patterns in their run. Authors also kind of concluded that these forces over time may lead to, again, those higher loading rates that might induce like a higher injury risk over time if individuals aren't able to adapt. However, like long-term studies are going to be needed to determine if runners are maybe eventually able to adapt. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, I think, 6 weeks is not a whole lot of time to adapt, especially perhaps in an experienced runner that's been running the same way for, like an average of 10 years. So, yeah, good. All right. So now, I just wanted to facilitate a little bit of conversation. Like, what do you guys think? So I mentioned overground training is what was used, or overground testing rather. I don't think they really said if the mileage on their end was completed overground or on treadmill, but they did all their testing overground. So do you guys think that might have changed anything that we saw in the results?
Yeah, I think it might have changed a little bit. It depends like the condition of the grounds too, because like we're already wearing a maximal shoe. Depends if it like just rain, the ground could be softer. It depends like what type of terrain you're on, if it's a road or grass. I don't know if that would have mattered too much, but it's a good variable they could have controlled for.
Mm-hmm.
I think like mechanically, if you're on a treadmill, you might think more about your running pattern than if you're on like a overground. I feel like when you're running like outside or something, you kind of have like the end goal in mind, like I'm gonna run this far and I'm gonna come back and I'm gonna end here. But on a treadmill, you're kind of just running in place, and so you're thinking more about each step more than like what's ahead of you moving forward. Kind of that visual distraction of running outside is a little bit more, could have impacted the results a little bit more than treadmill.
Yeah.
I think something I thought about too was that peak dorsiflexion range of motion and the prolonged eversion you were talking about. I think those could have been influenced by running over ground because you see more uneven terrain. But
Yeah. So like you might have less dorsiflexion, I think, just in reaction to like you're wanting to get on the ground quicker, right?
Mhm.
If you're more worried about stabilization. Yeah. So I think that it's definitely worth like looking, maybe like repeating the study, even if it was on treadmill versus over ground.
Mhm.
Okay. What do you guys think about, I mentioned like the experience of the runners. Do you think that might have changed anything that we saw in the results versus like looking at less experienced runners?
I feel like yes, because I feel like as PTs, we're always talking about how it's like very hard to treat chronic issues because people learn to move in different ways when it's a chronic issue that they've lived with for a while. And if these runners are like 10-year experienced runners, they're gonna have they're they're gonna have a movement pattern that they've adopted over the last 10 years.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Anything else that you guys had? I agree. Like, I think that it's harder to change somebody's patterns, like if they've done that for years, all right? Like, especially in a 6-week protocol, I think it'd be harder to change the way that someone's moving, regardless of their transition. Okay. Anything else? All right. Well, that's all I had for you guys.
Thanks.
Okay, go to more. And then record and transcribe, stop recording. And then hit stop.